Again, good morning. So let's continue our webinar, and I should like to welcome on behalf of all of us, Dr. Doris Reisinger. I should like to introduce the next speaker, Doris Reisinger, and to introduce her, I should like to mention a few things about her biography. Since in the period 2011, she was a member of the Opus spiritual family as a Sister Doris Wanner. Then she left the community due to abuse. In 2014, she published her experiences in a book entitled Nicht mehr ich. In Italian, No More Me, the story of a young religious. In this book, she shared her experiences. As to her involvement with the church, she's the counselor and point of contact for the bishops' conference for the women that have been abused within the church. As to her academic career, in the period 2008-2014, she studied philosophy and theology in Rome, Freiburg, Glasgow, and Erfurt. And in the period 2014-2019, she prepared her dissertation on philosophy at Westfälische University in Münster. Currently, she is an assistant researcher at the Department of Catholic Theology at the Goethe University and fellow in the project Gender, Sex and Power in the Indiana Notre Dame University. Her current research includes philosophical theory of spirituality and an examination of cases of reproductive violence within the context of abuse on child abuse within the church. Amongst their publications relevant for our webinar, we may mention a few books and a few writings. In 2019, she published together with the Cardinal Christopher Schönborn the book entitled Guilt and Responsibility. And this year, latest book is entitled Dangerous Theology, so when theological approaches legitimate the abuse of power. Dr. Doris Reisinger, with her books, with her articles, but also with her media work and with the footages, has done a lot of things for us to be sensitized more on the issue of spiritual and sexual abuse against women, against sisters, and in general in religious life. So, dear Doris, should like to welcome you wholeheartedly. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I should like to ask you to present your work. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introductory words. It makes me become red. I'm very grateful, and I'm very moved to be able to address you today, because I've been told that most of you speak Italian and understand Italian. So this gives me the opportunity of speaking Italian, which is a great pleasure to me. Medias in res, a preliminary note. Now, the theme of spiritual abuse we are talking about today is not a marginal theme. It's not a minor form of abuse, as if sexual abuse were big and obscure evil, whereas spiritual abuse is not so bad. Both of them are very serious, and in a way, spiritual abuse is even worse. Why? Because spiritual abuse and sexual abuse within the church are closely related. Every case of sexual abuse is preceded by spiritual abuse, and often the lines are blurred. And second, the spiritual abuse itself can inflict a trauma as severe and long-lasting as sexual abuse. But the most serious thing is that spiritual abuse affects the very core of Christian life. And we need to understand this. It affects the very core of Christian life, faith, and the most important prerequisite of faith, spiritual freedom. Therefore, spiritual abuse is not a marginal issue for the Church, and especially not a marginal issue for religious orders, whose survival is jeopardized by such a phenomenon. In many cases, now familiar to many of us, religious life has been seized, if you like, stolen by people who saw it and see it as an ideal structure to attract young people, idealists, make them dependent and use them for their own purposes, exploiting and tormenting them in many ways. We know these cases, and it is important to mention the names. Just think of Martial Maciel, Brother Ephraim, Thierry de Roussy, or Gino Borresi, and many others. Turns out that, unfortunately, religious life is particularly vulnerable to spiritual abuse. Therefore, anyone who wishes to preserve and defend religious life in its depth, in its richness and beauty, must address this phenomenon and remedy this vulnerability of religious life. In the long run, in my opinion, this requires more than a change of culture. A change of culture in itself is not enough. Solid reforms are needed in canon law and in the law of the religious. I sincerely hope that these reforms will be carried out. And I feel very honored to be able to speak with you, because I believe that you play a decisive role, not only in the fight against spiritual abuse, but also in the defense of true religious life against people who use it as a trap, as easy access to exploitable young people. So this said, as a preliminary note, I move on to the definition. What is spiritual abuse? Depending on your professional experience, you will define the term differently. This morning, we have already heard a psychological approach by Sister Caterina. It is crucial in this context. As a theologian, I want to take a theological approach and definition. It also seems to me that the scope of the question becomes particularly clear from a theological perspective. What then is spiritual abuse? Spiritual abuse is the violation of another person's inner freedom. And as such, it is at the same time also the violation of their personal relationship with God, which is necessarily based on their inner freedom. Without freedom, the foundation of faith is missing. Without freedom, faith cannot be born. And if inner freedom is destroyed, faith and dedication to God are destroyed along with it. Formulated with reference to Gaudium et Spes, spiritual abuse is a violation of the most secret core and man's sanctum, where he is alone with God, whose voice resounds in his own intimacy. And that is why the violation of a person's inner freedom is terrible, because that freedom is the necessary and indispensable condition of faith, and also the condition of every personal relationship, every friendship, every intellectual and spiritual development. It can be said that an imposed act of faith is a contradiction in terms. If a person's faith is not free, it is not faith. And here we are dealing with a theological principle in which there's a global consensus. I don't think anyone seriously questions that. Now, freedom is the prerequisite for faith, and it follows with the logical necessity that this also applies to every single act of faith. A forced act is not and can never be an act of faith. Indeed, forcing it is cruel, not only because forcing can hurt a person emotionally, but also because such forcing directly wounds a person's relationship with God, obscures her view of God, and in extreme cases condemns a person to a life without God. It is easy to understand why spiritual abuse is incompatible with the life in the evangelical councils. Because just as interior freedom is the precondition of faith and of every single act of faith, so interior freedom is the logical and necessary precondition of religious life and of every single vow, and especially of every act of obedience in religious life. A religious life that is not freely chosen or not lived with interior freedom is not, in fact, religious life. Sorry if this sounds a bit too abstract and dry so far. I will get more specific in a moment. Another definition. What does freedom mean? Or violation of freedom within this context? If we consider freedom as a precondition for acts of faith and religious life itself, of course, freedom here is not only meant formally or in a legalistic sense. Not being in chains is not enough to be inwardly and spiritually free. One person can be in chains and be spiritually free, while another can literally hold keys, mobile phone, and money, and at the same time be internally trapped and not free at all. Possessing the inner freedom means really wanting to do what you do, and not just doing it by force or for lack of alternatives. To be inwardly free means to be able to make a decision about one's life, aware of the scope and implications of that decision for one's person, and to assume the responsibilities associated with that decision. To be interiorly free means not delegating one's interiority, one's spiritual, emotional, intellectual life to someone else who directs it from outside and in the meantime erases the individuality and the depth of my person so that neither God nor the people around me recognize me anymore. Being spiritually free means living my spiritual life with the fullness of my irreplaceable and complex individuality and finding equally individual answers to my singular questions. Before entering into further details, let me give the last distinction between inner freedom and outer freedom. This distinction is of paramount importance. When we speak of freedom as a prerequisite of faith, we always mean a person's inner freedom. It is absolutely essential to understand that in the external sphere, in everything that concerns common life and prayer, there can be restrictions and compromises of personal freedom. For example, when we do things for the benefit of others, even though we would prefer not to, and which, if we're free to decide for ourselves, we would not do, because on the outside, and only on the outside, we have to strike a balance between the needs of all. It's normal. In the internal sphere, on the other hand, in everything that concerns a person's intimate and personal life, there must never be such compromises, i.e. things that one does for the benefit of another, even if one does not share them and would have preferred not to. Never, because in personal interiority, no one else has a say. Not the superior, not the sister, not even the founder. Only God. And neither the superior, nor the sister, nor priest, nor founder can hear God's voice inside a person better than she can hear it herself. Here in her intimacy, she's alone with God, and whoever enters here by force or deception is a thief and a rapist. But often, very often, superiors or sisters or brothers sneak into this inner sanctum where they really have nothing to do and cross the boundary between the outer and the inner realms, not out of malice or with evil intentions, but simply out of habit or carelessness. And in these cases, the consequences may not always be serious sometimes, but they are still abuses that can sometimes cast a long shadow over a life of a person. Let me give an example. Once, after a talk, a religious asked me the following question. He said, we have a rule that the youngest, that is the one who entered the last, must clean the toilet in order to grow in humility. And the priest asked me, does this rule constitute spiritual abuse? I replied, no. No, the fact that he has to clean the toilet is not an abuse in itself. But the justification that he should do it in order to grow in humility, that is abusive. The question of who cleans the toilet is a question of the external sphere, which must be resolved pragmatically. If not, we end up in a spiral of absurdity, as if the toilet does not need to be cleaned because it needs to be cleaned, but because a certain brother is still too proud. And then what presumption to want to judge if that poor brother needs to grow in humility more than the rest of the brothers. Please understand me well. I do not even want to say that cleaning cannot have spiritual significance. I think it has, and cleaning can have a very deep spiritual significance. But, however, what meaning cleaning the toilet has for that young friar is nobody's business but his own. A religious community must regulate these external things in the external sphere on a reasonable and pragmatic level, without using the inner life of its members as a pretext. In the outer realm, there can and must always be compromises. But in the inner realm, things are different. In the inner realm, in relation to a person's inner freedom, to that core, no one has a say. Here, it is a question of separating the internal forum and the external forum. As Sister Catherine said, that this is a central norm of canon law with which the ecclesiastical legislator seeks to protect interior freedom. The religious, as all people in the church, have a right to choose freely their spiritual accompaniment, and their superior do not have a say in this decision, and this is of paramount importance. So this is very important. So spiritual directors cannot give to superiors information about the interior life of those who are entrusted to them. Canon 630 of the Code of Canon Law is very clear here. It says, superiors shall grant religious due freedom with regard to the sacrament of penance and the direction of conscience. And it states superiors should not listen to the confessions of their subjects, and it is forbidden for superiors to induce them in any way to express their conscience to them. It's all too clear. It's very clear. In many cases, however, this norm is systematically undermined. Now, I know a few cases where the superior claims for herself the office of spiritual director and responsible for the formation of the sisters without giving them a choice. And when things go wrong, her brother in the flesh is the prescribed confessor to whom all the sisters must go to confession once a month, while brother and sister have a confidential conversation once a month about the spiritual progress of the sisters. And this quite often happens in religious communities. Such a system seriously undermines the freedom of the sisters and can have terrible consequences for individuals and the institute. When such relationships have become the norm, it is serious and fatal violation of the inner freedom and rights of the women religious involved, where external and spiritual leadership are in one hand or not clearly separated. This is at least a clear and worrying warning sign. And often in such communities, there are serious and very serious forms of spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse usually starts in a subtle way. A person's inner freedom is not directly attacked normally. Instead, it is obstructed. And it is only when a person has already lost the awareness of inner freedom and dignity and is no longer able to defend it that the worst abuses and acts of violence occur. To better understand this slow process, I distinguish three forms of spiritual abuse: neglect, manipulation, and finally, explicit violence. I will give an example for each of these three forms. These are real-life, recent examples, experiences that religious people in Europe have suffered in just this way, and they are not the worst cases I could relate, because I'm not interested in scandalizing, but there are much worse cases, as you probably know better than me. But rather, I've chosen the following examples because I think they best illustrate what spiritual abuse is and what it means for religious. First, spiritual negligence. Spiritual neglect occurs where people's spiritual freedom and self-efficacy are not sustained, when they do not have access to the spiritual food they need, and when what is given to them, while perhaps good for others, does not help everyone equally, because the personality and situation of some is clearly different from that of others. This form of neglect is experienced by religious who do not have adequate spiritual formation, but must resign themselves to spiritual responses that do not support them. Religious whose community is strongly marked by one-sided and meager spirituality, and religious who have special personal stories that would also need special spiritual support that they do not receive. In most cases, it is not that they do not receive spiritual nourishment at all. Rather, what they get completely lacks in what they need. It is like offering a glass of milk to a person with lactose intolerance. What they receive does not nourish them. On the contrary, it harms them. There are many religious who live in such a state of neglect, while superiors and leaders either do not care or do not even notice or accept with indifference that people in their community spend their lives neglected, hungry, and without the necessary spiritual resources, or even blame the neglected themselves. And why? Because perhaps the superiors themselves have been spiritually neglected and do not know any better. The tragedy is spiritually neglected people cannot manage their life's journey well. With every attempt to move forward somehow, with or in spite of their meager and inadequate resources, they hurt themselves and sometimes others. Just one example. You yourself will think of 1,000 more. It's the story of a young nun approaching her first profession. Her formator was also her spiritual director and superior in personal union. She taught the young nun that the vow of chastity had no practical reason, but a purely spiritual one, was rooted in love for God. But the nun could not grasp the meaning of that phrase, of that sentence. What use was it to God if she remained a virgin? What good was it to have no close friends, because in that community, even so-called special friendships were forbidden? The superior gave the young sister a text which said that to take a vow of chastity was to look at the flower on the roadside, but not to pick it. Even that sentence seemed to her a mockery. Of course, no life decision could be based on such a trivial metaphor. But what could she do? She approached the day of her profession in a state of inner perplexity. So much for spiritual neglect. Let us move on to the second form of spiritual abuse, manipulation. While spiritual neglect means indifference to the spiritual life of others, spiritual manipulation means taking control and dominating the spiritual life of others by whatever means, but often without admitting it, and preferably without them noticing. He who spiritually manipulates others makes them believe that they have acted in a certain way of their own free will, when in fact it was he who prompted them to do so, often with the help of certain techniques. That is, they're not really acting of their own free will, but doing what he wants them to do. For example, they take a certain view of their life or a certain life decision, say a certain prayer, or give money because he wants them to. These techniques, sometimes used instinctively and unconsciously, and sometimes consciously and cold-bloodedly, include a partially emotional staging, one-sided information, or the claiming of false facts, moral or emotional judgments, subtle threats, or the playing of power imbalances and relationship dynamics, all with the aim of dominating a person's inner life and spiritual life. When the founders or superiors of an order are manipulators, the whole community is often permeated by a manipulative atmosphere. In such a community, hardly anyone remains inwardly free. It's impossible. The subtle pressure starts even before entering. Everything is done to convince a person to enter. She's told how well she fits into the order, how loved she is, how wonderful life in the community is. And if she hesitates or asks difficult questions, the manipulating party shows disappointment or predicts a dark future for her, what will happen to her if she does not enter, and so on and so forth. Saying no is not a legitimate answer. A manipulator will never accept this. He attracts people, and once they submit to him, he can make them do anything. I've seen so many times anything. It will make them work day and night, makes them give up contact with old friends completely, makes them stop taking their vital medicines, and makes them rob their own parents and manipulate and pressure their own brothers and sisters in his name and in his example. Will take women to bed with him and tell them that it is a particularly deep spiritual relationship. And when they will become pregnant, it will make them abort. You know, if you have heard of such cases, I can assure you that they are real. I'm working these months on a research project dealing with such cases. And whatever the manipulator does, all the things he does is done in the name of something superior to which he gives an authoritative name, the way or the kingdom or the charism or the work or who knows what. Spiritual manipulation is like a brainwashing or a narcotic. Only when the effect wears off do the headaches come, and impositions and indecencies of the manipulator become more apparent. It is then often incredibly difficult and almost unbearable to realize the terrible harm that one is facing. Here again, just one example. This is the story of a young religious man in his community. A walking pilgrimage had been planned for a long time. However, the weather forecast for the chosen day was full of warnings of bad weather, and everyone in the house warned him that the pilgrimage would not be successful. Now, superiors did not want to change their plans, and they answered that if they they replied that if they set on out in faith, despite the bad weather, it would be a powerful act of trust in God, and God would protect them. Most of the brothers seemed completely convinced of this, so they all set out enthusiastic about the act of faith they thought they were performing. Most of them went out without umbrellas or raincoats. As soon as they were on the road, a heavy rainstorm began. The rain was so heavy that it became difficult to see. The group was separated. Before long, the city streets and underground stations were flooded. Only 5 of the 30 brothers who left reached their destination. Others were in great danger. Some had to be rescued from a tree on which they had taken refuge from the floodwaters. When in the evening the scattered brothers finally all returned home, the superiors stuck to their interpretation. They saw the day as a great blessing for the community. And finally, the last form of spiritual abuse is the most serious one, explicit violence. Those who exercise explicit spiritual violence, not content with subtly influencing the will of others, but to override it openly and brutally. This form of spiritual violence is only possible if the victim has already been neglected and spiritually manipulated before. Like other forms of spiritual abuse, the victim often knows and is aware that the superior is overriding his or her will, rights, and needs, suffers from this violence and feels wronged, but because he or she has previously been made to believe that the superior is always right and that his or her own needs are worthless or even corrupt and evil, he or she does not want to be abused, cannot oppose this violence. On the contrary, this is difficult to understand, but they will try to justify the actions of their superiors and defend them. In other words, the superiors who use this form of violence torture people who are already weak, who have almost no strength left to resist and cannot defend themselves. They break the cracked reed and extinguish the smoking lamp. Some pretend, some probably actually believe it, that they only the best interests of their brothers or sisters in mind, to lead them beyond themselves, to bring them closer to God. Others probably only live out their lust for dominion or their sadistic tendencies. Explicit violence, spiritual violence, is often particularly cruel. It hits people where it hurts most. Superiors who are cruel in this way break relationships and isolate religious people from their families and friends. For example, forcing them to give up their lost family photos or burn them in front of their superiors. Such things happen more often than you might think. I've heard on many occasions of this in different communities, forcing people to fast or work beyond their limits and putting their physical and mental health at risk, forcing members of their community to undergo exorcisms or certain contraindicated pseudo-medical therapies, all always in reference to God's will. Often this is accompanied by a certain form of glorification of suffering and an uncritical reading of Jesus' passion. According to the motto, Jesus has been crucified, now it is your turn. Those who are not ready to be humiliated and tormented by their superiors are considered comfortable, as if they did not understand religious life. For religious who experience this form of abuse, the pain of emotional and physical distress is still compounded by spiritual suffering. They've been led to believe that they are inadequate in God's eyes and that they will fail. Again, just one example. A nun told me this story. One year, while staying with her parents, she had a conversation with her brother. He confided in her that he was homosexual and asked her not to tell her father. They both knew how difficult it would be for the father to accept his son's homosexuality. As soon as she returned to the convent, she had to report to the superior. As usual, she told her everything, including the conversation with her brother. Then the superior asked her to write a letter to her father, informing him of his son's homosexuality. The young nun was shocked and asked why. The answer: she should have done it in obedience because she had taken a vow of obedience. Even if she felt so bad that she had to vomit, even if she felt she was betraying her brother, she obeyed. And so she would write that letter, and afterwards she felt as if she had been raped. She said to me, but she saw no way out. She believed she was bound by the vow of obedience. Now, I'm coming to the end. Religious life is wonderful. Religious life is wonderful when it preserves the spiritual freedom and autonomy of the people who lead it. When founders and superiors believe instead that they have to break the people entrusted to them so that they function without rebuttal, when they destroy their inner freedom and abuse it, it is terrible. For then it is no longer religious life, but rather resembles a form of slavery or a prison. As I said at the beginning, to avoid this, a simple culture change is not enough, and I'm fully convinced about this. A curriculum or appeals is not enough, because good superiors who are willing to listen already refrain from spiritual abuse. The question is how to deal with those who are inaccessible to appeals. Then we need solid canonical reforms to ensure that such abuses do not go unpunished, as they've been so far, and that the separation between external and internal spiritual governance is not only formally prescribed, but always guaranteed and effectively enforced, and that transgression is sanctioned. Religious, all religious, must live in legal certainty. I do not think this is too much to ask, especially since it is nothing less than the future and survival of religious life that is at stake. Thank you very much for listening. Dear Doris, thank you very much for such a deep speech that goes into the anthropological, theological roots of spiritual abuse. And thank you for giving us these very concrete, very practical examples. Sometimes very heavy, though we may imagine even worse examples. Thank you very much. And now, as we tried to do in the first block, as we would have liked to do for the first speaker. Let's start. Let me explain first, he says. So I've already explained how you organized for the parallel groups. So you need to have a facilitator and another person collecting the questions. I'll send you the link to the Google Doc. And please, only the person collecting the questions in the different languages have to open this link and use the Google Doc. Then we get back here. Well, I'd say 20 minutes for the groups. So wish you most fruitful job. And then we get back to the plenary to ask the questions to Doris.
Funziona. Allora, io chiedo alle
It does work. So for those who have not indicated their language, to please include the language before their name when they rename themselves, because there are many people who have not indicated their languages, and I cannot attribute them to the breakout rooms. So I don't know which language they may be interested in. If you like to go in a breakout room, this is what I'm doing now. I'm attributing people to the breakout rooms, but you need to indicate the language.
English. Okay.
La troisième, Agnès, je pense que c'est l'anglais aussi.
The third, Agnès, is for an English group.
I'm just asking people their language because I cannot. I'm trying to now to put people. So if you don't put the language, I see still English, German. I put people depending of the language. English. So if I think I have still some people who didn't put the language.
Monthly reports, I found that all those tools were not fully.
So I ask you to put the language. And Italiano, okay, Spagnolo. Français. So I ask people who are in this group to if you can put the language before your name. Sister, you have just to unmute yourself. If you want, you unmute yourself or you write on the chat and somebody can help you to change your name, because if you don't put the language, I don't know where to send you. Dovete cambiare il vostro nome, così posso...
You need to rename yourselves and put the language you're interested in for me to be able to send you in the right breakout room. She repeats the same thing in French, same instruction in French.
Okay. Si vous ne voulez pas aller dans un groupe, alors vous mettez pas votre langue.
If you don't want to be assigned to a breakout room, you don't put the language.
Ok. Français.
Maria, pode comprar um chocolate? Como você está tanto chocolatinho?
And please, alors, UN Sue, UN Sue, UN Sue, UN Sue, UN Sue, UN Sue, UN Sue. If I made a mistake, you can always UN Sue. Okay. Move to what she said. Sue, you wanted which language? You want English?
I want English, please.
Yes, yes, sorry, it's a mistake. Okay. Gloria, you have put English. You said you have put English. Gloria. Okay. Okay. It's because you put it after. Okay, I said it. Next time you put it before your name, because you put it just before. Thank you. So we still have Joanna, the same. Joanna, you put it before. I will move you to an English group. Okay. Zolt, when you use the chat now, it doesn't go to the groups.
Yes, I know. Per questo ho messo ancora prima dei gruppi.
Okay.
This is why I've written before the groups. Do hope that I have clicked on the link. Now it works, but it's difficult.
No, è difficile quando siamo più di 300. Adesso abbiamo trovato su un forum di Zoom una risposta che dice che c'è una... Quando siamo più di 300, io penso che devo chiedere qualcosa. Possiamo inviare unicamente le persone che hanno la ultima versione.
Sì.
O fare meno gruppi, quello che ho fatto oggi.
Sì.
Ma non lo sapevo.
Sì.
Penso che adesso sappiamo.
Ci sarà un gruppo UCESM?
Allora, volete, sì, posso fare, attends, vedo se c'è ancora spazi. Sì, c'era la possibilità di inviare. Perché il numero di gruppo è...
Adesso quanti gruppi?
Allora, sì, posso mandare, se volete, posso mandare tutti voi dell'UCESM in un gruppo.
Bene, grazie.
Okay, così potete...
Adesso quanti
Avevo paura... allora, quanti gruppi? 30.
30. E...
Allora, vi mando tutti nel gruppo. Sì? Tu voleva dire?
Un momento, Florence. E tu anche puoi aprire questo documento, no? Google.
Sì, sì.
E
sì.
forse come, scusi, broadcast message, can you send...
Okay, to everybody?
Sì, sì. Alcuni già stanno lavorando, come vedo, ma
Ecco, stanno già scrivendo.
alcuni gruppi ancora con...
Sì. Non so se vengono adesso le domande vengono dai gruppi o di nuovo individualmente scrivono come nella prima parte. Perché è molto presto che già scrivono.
Marjolaine? You are mute. You have to unmute. You have to unmute.
Here I am.
Yes, if you want to go to your group, you have at the bottom of your screen, breakout room. Or it is, if you don't see it, it's in more. And you have to click and you will go to the, I put all the UCESM together.
Okay.
So you can go directly to the group if you want.
The UCESM group.
Yes.
Not staff, no? But UCESM.
Staff.
Era già.
Yes, staff.
Okay, join.
The same for Doris.
How do I do this?
Doris, how do you, you just click at the bottom of your screen. You have breakout rooms. You have an icon, breakout rooms. Or if you don't have it, you have 3 dots with more. I don't know what is the language. And then inside the more, you have the breakout rooms. You click on it and you will go straight to your room. Stuff.
I see it, but when I click on it, nothing happens.
Yeah, that's the name. That's with me the same. I cannot join.
Okay, and even you cannot join. So we.
De nouveau, bonjour.
Voilà, je crois qu'on peut, ah non, tout le monde n'est pas revenu. Petit à petit. On va avoir le même problème. So I hope people will come back. Silvio? Silvio?
Sì, non si chiude.
No.
The person in charge of the languages to give the two questions in their own languages. So please, Doris, note down the questions, and then you can answer following the order you like or you prefer. For Italian, over to Sister Marjolaine. I'm here. We received many questions on formation. I cannot read all of them, and I know that in the next webinar will be focused on this topic of formation. I've chosen now two questions. There are methods, systems, and paths to prevent that have already been started by some communities. For example, information, not only for vocations, but for the individuals, for the persons, but also focusing on the topics and the role of power. Is there any positive experiences having to do with this? So this was question number one.
Doris, posso continuare?
Doris, can I go on? Are you there, Doris? Yes, yes, you can. Thank you. Second question, how to reconcile the importance of confidence-based relationships and open relations for human, Christian, and religious openness, but always respectful of boundaries and individuality, especially on the level of initial formation, which paths to be formed to accompany the other, being fully aware of all these important aspects of formation, how to be careful not to invade the intimacy of the other, and at the same time, without abandoning him or her. Very well. A question containing so many other questions. I had to choose. Thank you very much, Marjolaine. And now, or to Sister Margaret Mays for questions in English.
What is the responsibility of those of us who actually see abuse taking place? And how do we deal with the people who are abusing? Second, there are two parts to this. What do you feel needs to be changed in canon law in order to address this situation? But I think connected to that is the question of culture. How does culture play into the dynamics of this abuse? Thank you.
Tante grazie.
Thank you very much. And now over to French. Fratello Robert.
We have a lot of questions. Some have already been partially mentioned. I would like to mention two in particular. First, concerning majors. What is the risk of falling into the intimacy of a person? So how can we avoid this kind of risk? Second question. Sorry, second question.
Dico la conferenza in italiano.
Tagliarte tu usa uma in Italian.
Yes.
Pardon. OK. Donc, la deuxième question.
The second question, which has to do with formation. How should we form people to respect interior liberty so that it can be enhanced and safeguarded? Also to allow for a true religious life.
Grazie, Robert.
Thank you very much, Robert. And now over to questions in German. Sister Franziska.
Ja, einige Fragen überschneiden sich mit anderen Fragen.
There are some questions connected with that. There is still the attitude that the individualistic is seen very critically. We support the individual freedom and help that it can develop. We are gaining way more consciousness about this one. There are another question with 3 sub-questions. It's about obedience. How can we as community define obedience? How can we avoid that we contribute to this abuse? And how is the relationship between forum internum and forum externum? And there are many other questions, but these were the most important ones. Thank you.
Tante grazie. E adesso...
Thank you very much. And now over to questions in Spanish, Sister Ramona.
Sí, había varias preguntas
There
sobre
were several questions about formation that I suppose will be answered with the previous questions. Now I will choose one that says the spiritual abuse is very subtle. Sorry. Therefore, difficult to detect. And when the victim expresses to the superiors what is happening, it is often the word of the abuser against the one of the victim. What aspects or elements can be expressed so that it is not understood as an interpretation of the victim. Then there was another question about the person, the abuser, who becomes aware of what he or she is doing. So how can we help this person who wants to begin a process of awareness and healing? Thank you.
Tante grazie. Allora, cara Doris, c'è
over to Doris. You've received a long list of questions. Over to her. Well, so many questions. I like Italian, but I feel more at ease in English. So we'll be moving to English to answer the questions. So if you chosen translation, if you need translation, you can choose the channel you need.
I guess it doesn't make a difference where I begin, because now I've mixed up the notes, so I will not begin with the questions that were posed first. Yeah, there is this one question. Spiritual abuse is often so subtle, and how can you be sure that it is really abuse when you're confronted with a certain situation? And I think in parts, Katharina has already answered this question this morning, and it remains difficult. But I would say that the one crucial thing to do is not to pass a judgment quickly, and to listen, to watch carefully what is happening. Often spiritually abusive relationships develop over time, and you will need more time to watch and see what is happening. But as soon as you see that somebody becomes worse, loses his inner freedom, as soon as a kind of dependency develops, this is a clear sign for spiritual abuse. And also when a person changes quickly, very fast in a direction, loses her personality, things like that. These are clear signs. But you would have to judge and to look at every single case individually. And I would advise you to ask somebody else, do not decide these things on your own. Even if you are the superior and even if you're in charge, take somebody else to help you look at it. Yeah. I've been asked this question by bishops, and I always tell them, because bishops sometimes tend to listen to the abusive community, the abusive superiors themselves, and simply believe them. Do never, ever believe the people who are accused to abuse spiritually right away. Listen to them if need be, but do not take their word for granted, because when they are manipulative, they might be sometimes they're geniuses in manipulating people, and you may become manipulated yourself by them. So be careful when listening to those people. But there's this other question: how can we help abusers? Not every person who abuses somebody else spiritually does so consciously and purposefully. Sometimes, as I said, these situations develop without anybody wanting to harm somebody. It's just out of negligence, out of something else, out of an idealistic view or something. And so how do we help people who realize they have been spiritually abusive to get out of there and to begin their own healing process? And I would say, and this is actually an answer to many of your questions, the first thing to do is to develop a sense of that spiritual freedom is a fundamental right of everybody. Because many abusive relationships develop out of not being aware of this fact, So for an abuser or somebody who probably or eventually or maybe has abused somebody else, it's very important to understand precisely what exactly was wrong. Because often not everything somebody has said or done was wrong. But to detect the exact point where somebody crossed the border between forum externum and outer area and inner area of somebody else, to be precise and not to be too emotional. To be emotional when you're dealing with cases of spiritual abuse, take care never to be these cases are emotional, but try when you're dealing with them not to be emotional, because that never helps. There is this question that many of you have raised about formation. How can I, it seems to be a paradox. How can I help somebody to grow spiritually? How can I offer a kind of spiritual formation without being, putting pressure on somebody or influencing their spiritual life in a way that is abusive? And I think, honestly, it seems like a paradox, but I think it is not a paradox, because there's such a clear line between offering somebody spiritual nourishment and educating somebody spiritually and forcing somebody to do something spiritually. It seems like a paradox, and it is often mixed up, especially in religious life and formation to religious life, but it is not, in fact, a contradiction. So the important thing is to educate, to give input, to show people, to show your young brothers and sisters what religious life is, to educate them to understand the sources you're using, the rituals that are part of it and everything, but never cross the line where you force somebody to do something they do not want. Never cross the line where you pass judgment about their interior life. Take care always with, the things where you have to make compromises, and you even have to teach young religious members of religious communities to take compromises and to be obedient. It's important. It's an important step in formation, but this needs always to be in the external area, and it must also in the external area. It must never be. I'll come to this answering the next question, but this is the external area, and you will never judge or do anything in the interior area of somebody, even when you're responsible for their formation. The same is valid for, when it comes to obedience. I think in many ways, obedience as one of the three evangelical councils needs to be, and it has, in fact, there's so much literature being written on this, and you're probably much more familiar with it than I am. But this shows that, you know, there is a development and there needs to be a development, because at times in the past, religious obedience as an evangelical council has been understood in a wrong way, and it has hurt many religious people. And I think that's a first step to acknowledge this. This vow has been misused in order to abuse people. It's important to understand this. And how can we avoid that? We can avoid it when we limit the area in which obedience is asked of members of religious communities to the outer area. Only ever ask obedience in this outer area when it comes to, you know, fulfilling tasks, take part in whatever, you know, do things that can be watched, you know, do things in the outer area, and never cross this line. Like in the example with that priest who asked, you know, when it comes to cleaning the toilet, you can ask somebody to clean a toilet, but you cannot ask them to do it in a certain attitude, or to do it because they need to grow in humility or whatever, you know. And even when it comes only to this outer area, you'll have to take care to not hurt people, to not humiliate people, and to include every member of the community in decisions that concern everybody. But once something has been agreed on, you can ask people to be obedient. This is a delicate matter, and I think you're probably much more experienced in this than I am. But I think these are the two important things: never cross the border to the inner area of somebody else, and always include everybody who's concerned in decisions you're taking. And then you can ask obedience, and things that have to be done and nobody likes to do them, somebody has to do them, and you have to find in the community a way to define criteria how these kinds of decisions are being taken. And once they are taken, people have to follow the rules. It's easy, and it has been in the past. Spiritual abuses and obedience have been closely linked in religious life, but it's not necessarily the case, not at all. Yeah, one very important question. I see I have 4 more minutes left, and this question is really important, or the 2 questions. What is the responsibility of those who see abuse happening? And again, I think Katarina answered this question already this morning as well. I think it really depends on the role you have. When you are a superior and you see that another member of your community, like the sister who is in charge of formation, is abusing the novices, you know, turning them into, you're making them dependent from her and whatever, it's your responsibility to intervene. You do not only watch, you do not, you know, you have to intervene. And the first thing you would need to do is to find out what is really happening. But as soon as you are convinced and you have clear signs, again, try not to be too emotional. Try to find objective signs like dependency, like the novices are deteriorating, are using their inner liberty. Like often a sign is a kind of you know, group building, like when the novices develop in a way, you know, and are not open to the rest of the community anymore, you know, and circle building, you know, they are a circle of themselves. That is often a sign of spiritual abuse. And as soon as you're sure, you know, these signs are here, this is spiritual abuse, you have to intervene. Like, you know, you appoint another novice mistress and you make her step down, things like that. When you're superior and it's happening in your community, you're responsible. When you're watching it somewhere else, or another kind of, when it's happened in the past in your community, and ex-members are approaching you and tell you stories about what happened like 20 years ago, it might also be your responsibility to look into what happened 20 years ago and offer some kind of reconciliation and whatnot. And when you're watching it somewhere outside, it might be your responsibility, your moral obligation, not your formal and legal obligation, but your moral obligation to denounce it, to talk to the bishop, to whoever is in charge. And if it's the case that somebody is approaching you in a pastoral role, like as a priest or as a sister, to accompany them in a situation where they begin to talk about spiritual abuse they experienced some time ago, it's a pastoral responsibility you have. It might even be the case that you do not have the responsibility to intervene or to denounce somebody, but to accompany a person who has been traumatized. So it really depends on the role you have. The final question, what needs to change in canon law? To me, I'm not a canon lawyer, and the longer I've tried to look into canon law and the way it's dealing with abuse, with sexual abuse and with spiritual abuse, I'm all the more puzzled, because as I tried to point out in my talk, there are rules and there are very fundamental norms about, that protect the forum internum. But if somebody violates them, nothing happens. Nothing at all. I've tried it in many cases to assist people. You cannot denounce spiritual abuse. There is there's no way, even though it is forbidden by canon law, you cannot do anything against it. And that's the thing that needs to change. I wish for a reform of canon law that makes it, punishable to act spiritual abusive. And I don't know how to bring that about. I have no idea. I'm rather hopeless when it comes to this, but I think that is, unless this happens, we will have spiritual abuse going on in the church forever. And another thing, the final thing I want to say is something to stop spiritual abuse in religious life would be to have a proper assessment, which in theory it exists, proper process every new community has to go through in order to be finally officially papally recognized. But there's so much evidence to suggest that this process for decades has been neglected, and communities have been recognized which never should have been recognized. I've heard this sentence so often when it comes to abusive priests. A sentence you often find in documents, in church documents, is he should never have been ordained. And I think the same is true for many religious communities where spiritual abuse is rampant. They should never have been papally recognized, because it was clear from the outset, from the statutes, from their ideology, that they tend to be abusive. And I wish for a reform, I don't know, of canon law or of canonical procedures that help to install proper processes of assessment and prevent abusive communities from becoming officially recognized in the church. So it's 2 minutes past 1, but here I'm finished. Thank you.
Tante grazie, Doris.
Thank you very much, Doris. Well, no problem if you exceeded 2 minutes, the speaking time accorded to you. Well, these are very touching questions, have to do with our lives and the future of the religious life. So thank you very much for your speech and for answering the questions. Well, We're about to draw this to a close. To conclude this webinar, I can see in the chat room so many comments to thank organizers for this webinar. And I should like to spend a few words, a few concluding words. First of all, I should like to thank, not only on behalf of my personal name, but also in the name of all the participants, we should like to thank Sister Katharina and Doris for their speeches and for the preparation for this work and for all the work there's behind the speeches that you have delivered to us for the good of so many people. So wholeheartedly thank you. And then I should like to thank Florence and the technician of UISG for the work done despite all the Zoom difficulties and own technical difficulties. And I should like to thank very much the interpreters for their work. They've accompanied us during this day. And I should also like to thank my UCHESM cooperators, Sister Marjolin and Ms. Nicole, for making all this possible. Thanks a lot. And I should like to advertise, do a little bit of advertising. This was the first webinar. The next webinar will be held on May 18th. As you may know, many of you have already registered for this event. So we'll be continuing on this issue. And there will be two speakers. The first will be Sister Veronique Margron. She's the president of the French Conference of Major Superiors. And then with the brother Brendan Geary, they will be accompanying us again in our reflection on this topic. We've asked them to focus on spiritual abuse and community life, spiritual abuse, and how to live out the vows. Today, we've already touched upon these two topics, and we'll be analyzing them more in depth. And again, today's written texts will be published on our website, uchesm.net, and you will find them on our website. And as I said at the beginning, if personal questions do emerge, you can write to this to the email address you used to got registered, and we'll try and help you. And we're going to try and offer you help that may suit your case. So thank you very much again, everybody. Well, I think that we're all very touched by these two speeches, very deep speeches on this topic. They may be personal recalls or things from the past of our communities, or things that we've listened to from people who fell prey to perpetrators. So should like to invite you to pray, to concluding prayer, to trust ourselves and our communities and the victims to the Virgin Lady. So let's recite Hail Mary all together. And I think that I will be reciting Hail Mary, and you can follow. Switching off your mics, so we are united in prayer.
Padre e del Figlio e dello
In the name of
Spirito.
the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Ave Maria, piena di grazia, il Signore è con te. Tu sei benedetta fra le donne e benedetto è il frutto del tuo seno, Gesù. Santa Maria, Madre di Dio, prega per noi peccatori, adesso e nell'ora della nostra morte. Amen. Santa Maria, Madre delle religiose e dei religiosi, prega per noi.
Prega per noi.
Nel nome del Padre e del Figlio e dello
Spirito Santo, grazie.
Allora,
Grazie.
tante grazie per la
Grazie.
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 Grazie a tutti.
Grazie di cuore a
Muchas
tutti.
gracias.
Thank you
Grazie,
very
grazie,
much.
grazie.
Thank you.
Grazie mille.
Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Grazie, thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Maraming salamat po.
Grazie. Grazie.
Merci, frère Robert.
Gracias. Gracias tanto.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenas.
Gracias.
Grazie.
Adiós.
Gracias.
Un momento bello questo ultimo. Saluti.
Buona giornata e un buon